Well, that was something yesterday, wasn't it? How many of you went to Oakland? Pretty good. Not good enough. Good enough. I'm not going to raise the grade curve. I was going to give you all A's, but apparently you didn't. Huh? Next time. All right. Well, that was pretty interesting. Pretty successful, I'd say. I did. But I didn't have a lot of free time, so I was there for about an hour. I was supposed to be interviewed on KPFA, but I couldn't find them. So I got wandering around the plaza. So much for that. But I got interviewed by LA Times this morning. So we'll see if I get quoted in the LA Times. Okay. Well, back to more mundane matters. Global finance, which I believe some of this is all about. And we'll keep adding layers about finance. So last time we had pretty basic stuff about definitions, institutions, and what's money. And so today we'll spread our wings a little and start to talk about financial space and financial flows around the world and world monies and so on. So keys for today are that finance operates at many scales and it concentrates in certain places. Typical generalist economic geography, but still true of finances and other things. So we have major financial centers, and I'll also talk about tax havens and the same logic of clustering that we've seen before with industry. Finance also flows around the globe, crossing borders, going beyond national limits, national states and state controls, also beyond state regulation, I might add. And we won't talk about regulation particularly today, but a little bit. And linking up all these financial centers into what we have previously called a system of cities. Well, finance plays a big role in city systems. And those flows, of course, chiefly flows of capital, but also flows of income and wages. And then we'll talk about the problem of national monies and how they come together and are resolved or not resolved at the global level. And we'll talk about the dollar system and the euro system to wrap things up today. And a little bit about monetary policy, which remember we didn't discuss because we didn't have enough to go on when we talked about Keynesian stimulus back in lecture 4. So we have 3 topics today: financial spaces, financial flows, and international money. So financial spaces come at several scales, and this will be fairly pedestrian, but I want to go through this so we're clear about it, because it will matter when we're talking about finance and development in the next lecture. Financial centers, very important because finance is very lumpy. And then offshore finance, which at least gives me a chance to say some nasty things about finance today. Because the rest, well, I have more than that, but it's not my nastiest. I get nastiest next Thursday. Okay, so let's start with local finance. Local cities, local areas have always had their own banks. We have ones like Mechanics Bank here in the East Bay that recycle savings back to mortgages, car loans, and so on within the area. It's quite local. It doesn't have aspirations to be a global bank. Serves a local needs. It's that kind of utility bank we talk about. There are local banks that are branches of bigger banks, and the branch banking system expanded through the 20th century. This bevy of local banks under the Jacksonian system shrank and became more and more branches. But it was still pretty decentralized until 20 years ago, and as we saw the figure last time, the degree of concentration of banking assets has just accelerated over the last 20 years, and even more so since the financial crisis. So the Jacksonian system of a million little banks has been undermined, but not just in the last 20 years. That started with branch banking in the early 20th century. And of course, a lot of local banks went down, including with my grandparents' money in 1929. They had a lot of stock in the Tulsa National Bank. I got a lot of worthless stock certificates. Too bad. Could have been a rich man. Might have to do this lousy job. No, just kidding. I love my job. And we also have local investors. That is, there are people who are rich families locally who invest locally, rich key institutions. You see this especially historically. We'll come back to this some more next time. But in San Francisco, the famous names like the Ralstons or the Haases, the Goldman, the Crockers, all either had banks or were local investors, investing in everything, water systems and manufacturing and in the local universities and all those good things. Silicon Valley still has bevies of these kind of guys. Guys who made their money in Silicon Valley, made it with Google, and Google will do this, but also people who made money with Google, who may still work for them or maybe retired, started their own company, and also have, with some partners, they've started a little an angel investor group. And there's a zillion of these. We always hear about venture capital, but the angel investors are very important in startups in Silicon Valley. That, by the way, is a picture of Montgomery Street in about 1900 in San Francisco when it was called the Wall Street of the West. But now nobody bothered to occupy Montgomery Street. Doesn't seem that interesting. You want to go south market for the big boys. Except for Wells. They did go after Wells in one of the marches. And that is still on Montgomery Street. Okay, regional finance. Well, if we expand what's a region, of course, that's a fuzzy concept, but it's a concept we've used. California is a kind of region. Well, regions have key financiers or key players in regions. They recycle the savings and the capital of a region and plow it back into investment, plow it back into loans, create money locally through lending to expand the local economy and so on. So San Francisco banks, for example, played a huge role in the growth of California. Bank of America literally became the world's largest bank, entirely based in California. And it helped develop agriculture, the wine industry, Hollywood, Silicon Valley. Bank of America had its fingers in every pie. We also had, in some regions, like San Francisco, had capital exchanges, security markets, like the Pacific Coast Stock Exchange, which is a picture of it, which no longer operates because of globalization. It's no longer a player. There are people in San Francisco that do some trading, but there's no longer a Pacific Stock Exchange. There was the American Stock Exchange in Philadelphia, the Chicago Board of Trade in Chicago, which is still there, by the way. And they would list, like the reason Pacific Stock Exchange was created was to list regional corporations. So originally Chevron and who else? Companies like Kaiser that were local. Judson Steel would have listed on the Pacific Coast Exchange, not the New York Exchange. And then you have regional investment banks, and San Francisco's had a series of these for years. Blythe and Company, famously during the dot-com boom, Montgomery Securities, which was located in San Francisco but investing in high tech, both in Silicon Valley and Southern California and around, in East Bay and so on. And of course, the more you have a strong regional economy and you get strong regional financial institutions, that can make you into a major center like San Francisco, or a minor financial center like Atlanta, when the South wasn't very rich. Now, Atlanta's built up a lot over the years, although changes of banking have put the banking center of the South actually in Charlotte instead of in Atlanta. St. Louis, which was an important center in the 19th century, is not very important anymore. But Chicago and San Francisco would vie for a century, basically, vied for number 2 in the United States. National finance. Of course, countries have their financial institutions. This is the easiest to see. This is the way all the statistics are generally organized. And we talk about banks that are clearly nationwide associated with a national economy. Now, it's getting trickier now because so many of these are global banks at the same time. But National Westminster in Britain grew up as a British bank. Barclays grew up as a British bank all over Britain. CIBC, or whatever it's called, the Canadian Industrial Bank of Commerce, whatever it is. So a Canadian bank. Sumitomo, a Japanese bank. Bank Nacional de Paris, just a national bank originally. They grew up with each of those grew up with the national economies. Now, the U.S. now has national banks, as I said. The Jacksonian system's broken down, and we have the 4 big national banks and a few others that are beyond regional. We also have national exchanges. New York Stock Exchange rises along with the railroads, and then with the modern industrial corporations, the mergers, the turn of the century, the modern corporation, mostly listing through the New York Stock Exchange. And that becomes the most important stock exchange in the country. New York has more headquarters than any place. It is a financial center, and not just a banking center, but also a center for that kind of securities, capital, and securities exchanges. It also has the biggest investment banks. And national economies, the reason financial institutions are large or small on a world scale is generally because they belong to large national economies or small ones. And there's very few exceptions, but there are some, like Singapore banks, Dutch banks, and insurance companies, I think the world's largest, English, where the financial sector is much larger than the national economy. But if you look at a lot of the classic cases of our time, the biggest banks in the world for many, many years were American. Why? We were the biggest economy. When Japan came on like gangbusters in the 70s and 80s, suddenly at the end of the 80s, Japanese banks were amongst the biggest in the world. Everybody said, well, where did they come from? Well, they came out of Japan. Places, banks that were industrial banks in Osaka, which were regional industrial banks in Japan, suddenly became worldwide players, it seemed like. Now, actually, with the banking crisis in Japan, a lot of those Osaka banks have shrunk. But some of the Tokyo ones, Bank of Tokyo and so on, are worldwide now. Sumitomo's worldwide. Chinese banks. Why are Chinese banks suddenly? Why is what's it called? The Chinese Bank of Commerce? What's the Chinese Industrial Bank of Commerce? Whatever it is now the world's biggest bank in assets. Why? Because China's grown so much. So there's a very direct relationship between financial assets, financial operations, and national economies and national growth. Well, we'll talk about this more next time, but just want to get that established. At all these geographic levels, you've got banks and financiers who are linked to local economies, who are growing with local economies. They're actually serving those economies, and they're feeding off those economies. Now we have global finance, which is not new. It's been around. The British, well, the Dutch probably started it. But we'll forget about them. We'll move right. No, Axel isn't here, is he? No, okay, good. Oh, there you are. Okay. Sorry about the Dutch. I said one nice thing about them, though. Okay, British system, the Brits put together, as London was the financial center of the world, sterling was the standard, backed up by the gold standard, pound sterling was the major international currency in the 19th century in that glorious age of British hegemony. Well, British hegemony went along not only with being the biggest industrial economy, but also the biggest financial operator, were the British banks and investors. And their investors went all over the world, and their banks went all over the world, and they would have these agencies around the world. And already in the 1850s, there was a British agent in San Francisco, there were British agents in Mumbai, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, all places that we now think of as financial centers. A lot of them were already in the chain of the British Empire and the British financial system. Sorry. Have they grown in role? I'll get back to that because London is still one of the 2 prime centers of the world. It's kept that role. More than, say, Amsterdam has, although it's still important in Europe. Now, of course, when the British system collapses and you get the interwar period, the World War period, as Europe destroys itself, destroys trade shrinks, international finance shrinks too. The U.S. is not doing much international financing. Britain is shrinking and having problems of its own. Barriers have gone up and moving money around and so on. But after World War II, we re-globalized finance under the Bretton Woods system, under American hegemony, just like we talked about before. And part of Bretton Woods was financial organization, as you remember. It is very much about the World Bank, the IMF, and trade, and stabilizing the world financial system so that it wouldn't. So it could grow out of that stagnation of the interwar period. And that was designed in part by John Maynard Keynes, who, as I told you, was very interested in money and finance and took it very seriously. But by the 1960s, you start to get actual global banking again. Money is really starting to flow, and it's almost all flowing in dollars. And there starts to be out of London something called the Eurodollar market, which is people, banks actually lending dollars out of London for international development, because everybody wants dollars. There's a lot of dollar export. There's a lot of dollars piling up in London banks through European reconstruction, and then the banks are lending it out. And some American banks then start to get in on that action. That's, by the way, London in the 19th century, and that's New York in about, it has to be after the building of is that the Chrysler building? Yeah, that's Chrysler. So that's got to be 1930s or 40s. In global finance today, we have these huge international banks, some of which are present here. You would know them, but some of them you would not see in California or even in the U.S. HSBC doesn't have a big presence. You see it a little. It's a London-Hong Kong connection going way back. Barclays is a huge world bank. Banque Nationale Suisse is a huge world bank. Deutsche Bank is a huge world bank, and so on. That's actually the headquarters of Deutsche Bank in Frankfurt, I believe. And that's HSBC's headquarters in Hong Kong, which looks remarkably like a old director's set or something out of Star Wars. And they will have branches, again, like the Bank of America did in the U.S., have branches all over the world. They're collecting deposits from all over the world and lending all over the world. Often, their branches are lending regionally, actually. But sometimes they're moving between those centers, depending on international conditions. And we have international exchanges. New York Stock Exchange is now merged with Euronext. It's quite globalized, across the Atlantic especially. London Stock Exchange handles transactions and investments from all over the world. Tokyo, less so, but it's still connected in. And then Hong Kong, of course, very important these days, and now Shanghai and Singapore, bringing the Asian centers into this global network of financial centers. Okay, so these are global investment flows and securities, which I'll have more to say about. Okay, so that was pretty simple. Now, financial centers.
So it's more centralized.
There's just more global operators. Is it more centralized? Yeah, I suppose you'd have to say probably concentration ratios are up. I've never seen any tables of concentration ratios at an international level, though. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to argue that concentration was very high at an international level. Yeah.
How does sister banks work? How do you go about
Yeah, they have deals. Sometimes they are simply alliances. Sometimes they actually have invested in one another. One's a subsidiary of the other. Sometimes it's hard to tell. Since we didn't talk about business organization, we haven't really dealt with that. But yeah, they just have agreements. Yeah.
Has the internet impacted the global flow plan?
Yes. Yeah. You can move these security guys. Well, yeah, I should have a slide on that. All that. Yeah, why didn't I have that? The wires going on.
Isn't that a big thing?
Yeah. Because you can do these electronic transfers between these centers pretty instantaneously. Yeah, why didn't I have a slide on that? Wasn't thinking. Sorry about that. Yeah.
The guy talks about that. He says the internet has increased the speed, but even with the tougher wire, you could still move international finance around.
Yeah, and the Brits did do it. That was like the big news of the late 19th century, is putting out international telegraph cables. So you could actually get the news very fast. And most of that, and I don't know if I said it, but the majority of information passing through the internet to this day is financial information. I haven't seen a recent study, but a geographer did a study about in the 90s that showed that something like 60% of all information, we talk about the information society, moving around is actually money. It's money. It's money and prices and financial information. Now, why didn't I have that thing about? It's a shame on me. I wouldn't have had it here. I would have had it later, but I still don't have it. Shoot, what an idiot. Okay. Oh, well, sometimes we brain lock. Okay, financial districts. Financial districts are the same logic of clustering. Finance loves to cluster in big cities, and indeed, finance is a big part of big city growth. The key cities of the world are all financial centers, almost without exception. The logic is the same. It's financial firms intersecting, doing business with each other, being in the know, the highly specialized labor pools that you get in places like London and New York, the auxiliary services, the accountants and the lawyers, the engineers, the IT guys who are going to keep the banks moving, well-oiled, keep their ATI systems well-oiled and so on. And finally, prestige. Finance is very much a reputational thing, even more than industry. So financial companies like to have the rep of being in a major center, being on a major street, having a major address. And indeed, industrial corporations like Chevron, oil companies are more dispersed than finances. Banks are almost all still headquartered in big cities, whereas most industrial corporations have moved their headquarters out to suburbs and just keep a listening post in cities. San Francisco's lost virtually all of its major corporations to the 680 corridor and so on. That's where Chevron is. PG&E moved out there because we don't control PG&E anymore. I mean, in Dallas, well, AT&T is in Dallas, but they're probably up there in North Dallas, one of those godforsaken office parks, right? They're not downtown. They're still in the metropolitan area, but they're not downtown. And I think it's because industrial corporations are more self-contained. They know what they're making. They're very specialized. They're doing their thing. They've got their employees. They integrate a lot more stuff. The financiers have to really have their ears to the ground, or their ears open to everything, because they're the ones that are, as we'll talk more about, they're the ones that are overseeing the system. They're the ones who are watching for opportunities and avoiding risks and losses. They have to be attuned. So you've got to be where the action is. It's like being in Silicon Valley or Hollywood. You've got to be in the know, and you really can't be off in Podunksville. Finance is a big part of what knits together city systems. Always has been, whether it was telegraph lines, and really good, fast communication in the 19th century, or in the 20th century, really good internet. And interestingly enough, I looked at a whole bunch of stuff. If you look at internet domain names and the geography of it, one of my former students did a book on this in the early 2000s. Of course, Bay Area was number one for a very long time. Probably still is, because it invented most of this stuff. Okay, but number two was New York, and then London. Why? And then you got Washington and LA. And why London and New York? Because internet companies and internet domains are being used by financial companies and financial service companies and so on in those big complexes. Not out here, it's much more, the internet, Silicon Valley guys are using the internet to communicate, to develop the next iPad. But in New York, they're developing the next derivative. Okay, so we got global cities where you have those major banks like HSBC headquartered in London, although I think it was moving back to Hong Kong. Barclays in London, that sort of thing. Citicorp in New York. The major exchanges, and I'll give you some more examples in a sec. Huge supporting clusters and labor pools and so on. And then you get the regional centers that will have your major national banks, some national banks, or regional divisional headquarters of national banks and so on. Maybe a few, like San Francisco will have some international banks. Will put a small agency in San Francisco to kind of be around to check out what's going on there. They also have a lot of these boutique investment banks and securities transactions. Now, minor centers have no banks, or no big banks, and no securities exchanges, and no significant investment banks, or any of those kind of funds. And that really costs them. So smaller cities tend to really suffer from a lack of finance activities, which tend to concentrate in the biggest cities in the upper parts of the hierarchy. In the U.S., after New York, which of course is a global center, Chicago always dominated the Midwest. It also invented the modern derivative, but it also did commodity derivatives before that. So Chicago was the dominant, although Minneapolis got this niche in the upper Midwest and did very well, whereas cities like Detroit, which was so great in autos, never had much finance. And when Detroit autos left, downtown Detroit just disintegrated, had no finance. Same with Buffalo, Toledo. They weren't big banking centers. Columbus did better than Cleveland because it had more finance as well as government in Ohio. Charlotte, which was Nowheresville, is now this major city in the South because it managed to grab and create two huge banks, Wachovia and before it was Bank of America, whatever it was called. One was Union Bank and the other was Nations Bank, and became Bank of America when it merged with Bank of America in San Francisco and took it over. So Charlotte